Thanks to ECFR, to Joanna, to Kadri for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I also would like to thank you participants to come here to listen to such a boring topic as nuclear arms control. So thanks for taking your time. And I would also like to specify that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. The views are my own and not of the Diplomatic Academy or the Russian Foreign Ministry. Okay, so I mean, it's pretty hard to speak about arms control without saying that arms control is not having its best of times now. We don't have much of the arms control left. Basically, the only one treaty standing between US and Russia is the New START. United States also don't seem to be super interested in arms control, as we see, as Kadri mentioned, the latest treaty which fell victim to the Trump administration is the Open Skies, but it's not the first one and maybe even not the last one. So situation in the arms control sphere is not the brightest, and if US is interested in anything, that would be China and bringing China in. So that again is not something that Russia can do, which also complicates the picture. So the New START, as I said, is the only thing which is left. It only covers strategic nuclear systems, and it's gonna expire on February 5, 2021, if not extended. There have been some talk in the US that maybe they'll try to negotiate something new. We are now in June of 2020. Obviously, there's not enough time to negotiate anything new before the New START expires. Also, we are still in this pandemics, which prevents us from having business as usual. One of the meetings, one of the two remaining meetings of Bilateral Consultative Commission under the New START is a body which decides on the matters of which arise from the implementation of the treaty. It was cancelled, so we only have one left before the treaty expires, and it's going to happen in September or October. But overall, there is not much dialogue happening, unfortunately. So we can extend New START for up to 5 years, and that sounds like a great idea for everybody because the treaty is more or less in both countries' interests. In US, simple agreement by the executive would be enough. In Russia, it's slightly more complicated. You would need to have a federal law to ratify the extension, and there was a great paper specifically on this topic by Anton Khlopkov and Dasya Shavrova from CNS, which specifically looks in this issue. It's like really nuts and bolts of everything you need to know about this issue. The bottom line basically is that yes, Russia can extend a New START even if the new president would be elected and inaugurated in January of 2021. There'll be some time to extend because you can use the provisional application of this new thing that you're gonna ratify. So yeah, if you're interested in the specific topic, you can ask me about it in Q&A or read the paper. However, we don't really know if the US gonna extend the New START. Yeah, Russia, again, just to be clear, Russia has stated on a number of occasions that it's ready for unconditional extension, no strings attached, for full 5 years or less, how US prefers. So from the Russian perspective and from the perspective of Russian strategic community, a lot of previous treaties which were signed between Russia and the United States or Soviet Union and United States are seen as one-sided in one way or another. they were more favorable to the United States than they were to Russia. So, for example, INF treaty banned the ground-launched missiles, but did not ban sea-launched or air-launched, which were a special interest for the United States. Then START 1 placed sublimits on heavy ICBMs, which were the most important for the Soviet Union. And START 2 banned ICBM with multiple warheads altogether, which were also very important for the Soviet Union. So in that sense, the New START, the Treaty of 2010, is seen as really one of the few equitable treaties. There is no provisions which limits Russia, but not the United States. So if the United States decide not to extend the treaty, it will be seen as stepping back from this general point and trying to get an edge over Russia. So if New START is not extended, any subsequent proposal from Washington would be evaluated through that lens that US is trying to game the system here. So what happens if United States decide not to extend the New START and it expires in February 2021? Well, I have just co-authored the paper just on that question, and it's a lot most will depend on US approach. So one scenario is that United States just says that they're not interested in any kind of arms control and any kind of limitations, and that they, it's great power competition age, and they will win in these great power competitions. They don't want to have any limitations whatsoever. That's possible. So in this scenario, me and my co-authors argued that Russia would be wise to focus on the threat reduction mechanisms. There are a number of treaties which are still in place from the Soviet times. It's the agreement on nuclear threat reduction centers, the hotlines. Then there is an agreement on ICBM launch notification. We exchanged those information. Agreement on notification of major exercises with nuclear component. So that would be in the interest of Russia to keep those agreements and continue to exchange this information and make sure there's nothing nasty happening, even if nobody wants it. Then Russia would be smart to propose to state basically that it will not exceed the New START limits unless US does the same. So first of all, that would be it would have a long tradition in Russian foreign policy. We did that on a number of occasions, but also it would be maybe an argument for those in the United States who don't want to have a new arms race. So Russia can move unilaterally, but maybe that would be a meaningful thing to do. Then, of course, all information exchanges on the numbers of forces will end at this point. And I would say that probably Russia would be better off here because you can get much more information from open sources on the US forces and on the Russian forces. So maybe that's another, reason for US to extend the New START, but I'm not sure that's how it's seen in Washington. And of course, you cannot rule out that the next administration, which comes in 4 years, will decide to get back to arms control. So we argue that it would be important to preserve the infrastructure required for swift return to negotiations and rapid implementation of any new deal. For example, there is National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center. It's a part of Ministry of Defense in Russia, which deals with arms control treaties. So we say that we should preserve those resources even if the workload will fall sharply if New START is not extended. But that's pretty much it. Russia wouldn't be able to do too much on its own if US is not interested. On the other hand, if US would be interested in some kind of arms control, just not the legally binding one, we can discuss why is that and if US wants to still get some advantages, but the bottom line is even political agreements would be beneficial for Russia in this case. So we can agree not to extend the numbers about the New START treaty limits. We can agree on exchange of information. There are ways to do so. We can agree not to impede the national technical means, so we can maybe look at each other from above, and it will help a little bit to verify, but of course it will be much inferior to what we have under the New START. And we can even maybe talk about preserving the inspection regime. That would be really, really out there to propose something like this, but we have some examples when we have verification and inspections even without legally binding treaties, for example, under the Vienna document, OSCE Vienna document. So again, we can discuss this in more details in Q&A if you want. But of course, as I said, this will be largely depending on what United States administration decides and who probably wins the election in November. So, as I said, we don't discuss the New START currently because Washington, at least from official point of view, is still having interagency deliberations, which are now in their third year, and they continue on the merits of extension. So what do we do while we are not discussing New START? We are discussing sort of everything else. We have so-called strategic stability or strategic security dialogue. We meet twice a year, and basically for a day or two, and it's enough to exchange grievances, but not enough to do anything else apart from exchange of grievances. But there have been some progress here. So in January, the parties agreed that they'll form working groups to study specific issues in more details. And the first one was chosen, the space security was chosen as the first one to look deeper. But again, it's now June, no meetings happened, and it's not like anything is happening in the upcoming months, and then elections are in November. President Trump has also appointed a special envoy for arms control talks, Marshall Billingsley, who is sort of supposed to run those arms control negotiations. In his first interview to the Washington Times, Marshall Billingsley pretty much gave no reason for either Russia or China to participate in those negotiations. It was a breathtaking example of they will have to do whatever we want. We're not planning to give anything back in return. So I can only feel sorry for my colleagues at the foreign ministry who have to engage in those negotiations or even discussions, because we're not at the negotiation stage. So I'll just briefly mention this whole idea of trilateral arms control. So as I said, US is mostly interested in China, and that's not a secret. So US are trying to corral China into doing arms control and putting more or less officially Chinese participation as a precondition for any future arms control talks or negotiations. China is not interested. China has been on the record saying it's not interested and repeated it a lot of times. And it hasn't even answered to a formal invitation which United States sent them sometime in December to come to the negotiations. China is still ignoring United States on this issue. So you can see that it's not really working. And again, to be clear, Russia will not be pushing China to participate in those negotiations. First of all, Russia doesn't really need nuclear arms control with China, at least not the strategic nuclear arms control with China. In the spheres we need arms control with China, we already have it. We have conventional arms control with the demilitarization of our border. Like where there's a need, we already have it. We don't have it on nuclear, which tells you something. The second thing is China is not interested, and when deciding on either to push China and make China unhappy just to please the United States, I guess the choice is clear. Russia is partners with China. This partnership is getting even stronger, and there is no way Russia gonna do bidding for the United States on this issue. What else is there on this virtual table to which the countries at some point might get and discuss once there is political will? So Washington had repeatedly insisted that Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, should be part of any future arms control agreements. Russia responds by saying that in that case, US non-strategic nuclear weapons, gravity bombs in Europe, should be withdrawn from Europe. That would be a hard ask for any US administration, because that's part of NATO cohesion and transatlantic partnership, how we call it. Then US also wants that all new Russian strategic systems be the part of future arms control agreements. Some of them actually are non-controversial. The Avangard boost glide vehicle is accountable under the New START because it's mounted on an accountable ACBM. Sarmat heavy ACBM will also be accountable, but some of the newer systems like underwater torpedo and nuclear-powered cruise missiles are just not filling the definitions of strategic arms under the treaty. So US wants them included. Russia said it is ready to include them in theory, but Russia would obviously want something back in return. It's hard to say what that would be exactly, but since those were presented as a response to US missile defense, then Russia will probably want something on the missile defense. Yeah, and from the Russian side, the interest is with missile defense. It's not such strong as it used to be, because Russia has presented all those new weapons, which supposedly would defeat any missile defenses, but still that's an issue. And also Russia doesn't like the potential of placing weapons in space. Mainly it's about space-based missile defense again, but also about land attack as well. US conversely has been complaining about Russian ASAT capabilities, anti-satellite capabilities, and Russian activities of Russian inspector satellites, so-called inspector satellites. So there is some mutual concern here, and as I said, there are talks scheduled, maybe because this is seen as something maybe less controversial, and there is clear interest from both of the parties. So maybe something is possible on this front. Finally, the INF treaty is gone, but the issue of INF range missiles is not gone. The West, US and NATO still believe that Russian 9M729 missile has a range greater than 500 kilometers, that it's intermediate range missile. And this issue is not going away. So Russia has proposed the so-called moratorium, saying that it's not going to deploy intermediate range missiles if US doesn't deploy them in specific region. Unfortunately, there have not been any substantial discussion of this Russian proposal. There have been some interest from the French side, but that's pretty much it. NATO generally approach this idea as Russian propaganda, or the just a useful way for Russia to change the narrative. But in reality, as I said, the problem is not going to go away, and parties should either negotiate over it, or we'll see something similar to the Euro missile crisis once US decides to deploy its missiles in Europe. So we can start talking about Russian moratorium proposal, or we can start talking about some other proposals, but probably something realistic and not just saying that Russia is violating the treaty. The treaty is done, US left it. Again, as I said, we can then discuss if we're gonna have those issues negotiated and end with a formal treaty. We can do some political agreements. We can do some other things. Russia has been warming up to non-legally binding treaties, to political agreements as of lately. It feels it's better than nothing. If you can get something ratified from the US, maybe political agreement can be the next best thing. But Russia would want specific verifiable limits in any agreement. So if you agree on something, there should be a substance. Russia is not interested in transparency for the sake of transparency. That's not something Russia is really interested. So, for example, sticking to New START numbers after New START is expired is a workable idea. Proposal of information exchange without any limits is dead on arrival. Russia is not interested in that. I already talked about asymmetry of information. So Russia feels that it gets more information anyway. So why should it help the other side? And also on the very popular here nowadays risk reduction side, Russia is generally interested in real military risk reduction, which can arise from misunderstanding or a lack of communication. And we see this in Cold War hotlines. We see this in de-escalation agreements over Syria, and so on and so forth. So that's something tangible. But Russia also doesn't want to encourage destabilizing activities by decreasing perceived risks. And some forms of risk reduction can be seen as legalization of undesirable practices. So, for example, Russia is strongly opposed to risk reduction in cyberspace and outer space because it believes that it's a ploy from the Western side to justify and legitimize military use in cyberspace. In outer space, once you establish the rules of the road, then you can fight wars and they'll be legalized. Russia says no, we just don't want any of this happening at all. So the same is with arms control. If Russia sees that United States is dismantling all of the arms control and doing this, with a clear goal in mind, and then says that Russia should has more transparency and work with US on how to manage escalation, it doesn't look like a good bargain from Russian point of view. And this brings us to the fundamentals of the state policy in the field of nuclear deterrence, which Kadri mentioned, and which was sort of a surprise for all of us. It wasn't that much of a surprise that this fundamentals, this document would be produced, because the previous one was fundamentals of Russia's nuclear policy and Russian nuclear deterrence till 2020. We are in 2020, so there should be a new document. But the previous one was classified. And for some reason, Russia decided that this version would be openly available. It's hard to say why. One suggestion, my suggestion is that basically we had previously all of the information about Russian nuclear deterrence was in Russia's military doctrine. The last one was in 2014, and it doesn't seem that we're having a new one anytime soon, like not this year probably. And you would still want to clarify some things on nuclear front, then you just publish your specific nuclear deterrence document. But that's just an educated guess. There are no like super major changes, though there are some. So the general idea stays the same. Russia will answer with nuclear weapons in two cases. The first case is when it's attacked with nuclear weapons or with other weapons of mass destruction, or its allies are attacked with nuclear weapons or as weapons of mass destruction. And the second case is when Russia is attacked with conventional weapons and it's overwhelmed and the existence of state is at risk. So those two remain. Those are in the paragraph 19. And also I would have to stress, those are not automatic. Final decision will be taken by the president to use nuclear weapons, but those are the conditions under which this decision can be made. But then there is a new paragraph 19, which adds some nuances. The first one is that nuclear attack against Russia is much broader than previously thought. So any launch of ballistic missiles against Russia, if confirmed, could trigger Russian nuclear response. Russia will not wait until the missiles hit its territory. Again, I'm not sure this is going to be the case because, frankly, we never had nuclear wars, luckily, after 1945. So we don't know what would be the actions in the end. But there is a message, like, just don't send your missiles toward us. We're not going to discriminate and probably going to respond with nuclear force. The second thing is probably the most revolutionary. It says that attack against Russian nuclear forces and their infrastructure could also trigger nuclear response, even with conventional weapons. So this is new. Previously, this was like a gray zone. Everybody sort of understood that you should not attack each other nuclear forces, even with conventional weapons, but it wasn't laid down. Now it is. So that's basically the changes in Russian nuclear employment. Then there is also some things which are not necessarily about nuclear employment, but there's, for example, paragraph 12, which enumerates military risks, which can then become military threats, and which Russia is trying to deter with nuclear weapons. So this is not very specifically defined, and I guess that was the idea behind it. So it's unclear what does it mean and what what's going to happen with if the countries are doing those things. But there is a message that Russia doesn't like them. And basically, they all are about either hosting nuclear weapons on their territory or getting some kind of other strategic weapons, like precision-guided conventional weapons, or having missile defenses, or having space-based missile defenses. So everything connected to either attacking Russia or being able to attack Russia or being able to intercept Russian missiles, it's something Russia doesn't like. Probably it's not gonna respond with nuclear weapons towards it, but it was sort of important enough to put it in this nuclear deterrence document, which again maybe tells you something about what Russia maybe would want from some kind of arms control, though this will be a kind of different arms control. This will be something of a conventional kind and arms control in Europe kind. So I guess I will end here, and yeah, I'll be happy to answer your questions.